Paul Zankowski is the Agricultural Science Advisor at the USDA Office of the Chief Scientist. With that, I will turn it over to Paul.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm sorry I wasn't able to be at this year's NAPD meeting in person. I hope that you've all had a great week with lots of informative sessions and exchanges. What I want to tell you about is an updated roadmap for plant breeding that the USDA created using feedback from its stakeholders. The original roadmap was developed in 2015. The USDA Plant Breeding Working Group, which is made up of USDA staff from the Agricultural Research Service, the Forest Service, the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and the Natural Resource Conservation Service, devised a plan for a 2020 workshop that would help gather stakeholder input. To do this, we set up a USDA website to gather information from stakeholders. We used on-demand pre-recorded presentations to highlight the key breeding issues and help stimulate responses from an information gathering website. And we held a 2-hour live virtual session along with breakout sessions to help address gaps from the information website and to get feedback from USDA stakeholders. By holding this meeting, we wanted to highlight how the USDA has impacted plant breeding, showcase USDA's unique role for plant breeding, work to identify how the USDA can impact breeding into the future through intramural, extramural, and outreach efforts. Determine what the plant breeding community needed from the USDA over the next 5, 10, and 25 years, and then bring all that together to craft a new roadmap. The stakeholder meeting provided a platform where we could discuss what has been done and what could be done to breed for climate change, how the public and private sectors can work together, discuss new breeding tools, and consider the effects of federal regulation on the future of plant breeding. Since we needed to operate in a virtual forum in 2020, we structured the stakeholder meeting with a website to gather stakeholder feedback. Forums for both USDA leadership introductions and updates from the plant breeding activities within the 4 USDA agencies were provided. We also used keynote presentations to highlight some of the major topics in plant breeding, and we had breakout presentations that connected with the issues addressed on the information gathering website and helped us set up a way to gather feedback from the website, as well as during a live virtual session. Next, I'll discuss the information gathering website. We wanted to gather USDA stakeholders' input by using a website where our customers could provide input for these 5 questions. I'll provide more on the responses that we received later. We also designed the meeting with keynote presentations focusing on broad topics including breeding for climate change, new breeding tools, the prospects of breeding to enhance food safety, the impact of government regulations on breeding. All of these recorded presentations are still available on the website that you see up there. It can be accessed easily by just going to usda.gov/topics/plants. Next, I'll present the preliminary feedback that we received from stakeholders who responded to the information gathering website. Stakeholders provided responses to 5 questions posed on the website. For the first question, we asked for the ways that the private sector could partner with the USDA, and stakeholders voiced that the public sector should focus on long-term objectives and fundamental principles that complement the private sector, that there should be a mechanism for companies to co-sponsor public breeding research. There should be a means to facilitate communications and workshops, but there was concern that smaller scale crops may not benefit. We also identified gaps in the responses that we received, and we addressed those gaps during a live virtual session in November 2020. The gaps focused on developing partnerships for commodity crops and smaller scale crops, structuring partnerships, and how best to implement them. For the second question, we asked how should plant breeding be divided between the public and private sectors, and what role should the USDA play in this partnership? Stakeholders indicated that the public sector's focus should be in broad-based technologies, disease resistance, basic research, longer-term projects, especially regarding forest trees, small-scale crops, agronomic traits, and in training the next generation of plant breeders. For the private sector, they suggested focus on regional cultivars, ornamentals, growth traits, major-scale crops, and traditional breeding. Stakeholders were looking for collaborations on cover and orphan crops. Gaps were identified for the public-private plant breeding that have the potential to show quicker turnaround, and how best to prioritize public sector breeding to avoid duplication with the private sector. Again, we addressed those gaps during the live session. For the third question, we asked about the synergies between the public and private sectors. Were they effective and how could they be improved? Stakeholders indicated that synergies on commodities, oats, leafy greens, and some fruit and nuts were effective, as well as the role of the USDA germplasm collection. They felt that synergies for tree breeding for forest health and orphan crop synergies were not as effective. Stakeholders were also concerned that some synergies are being eroded between the public and private sectors, mainly over intellectual property protection through utility patents versus PVP. Also, stakeholders felt there was a lack of transparency for background and quality evaluations. The gaps that we found in responses were on examples of how synergies could be improved and how existing synergies could act as templates for other crops. For the fourth question on USDA's role in education and mentorship, the stakeholders are looking to the USDA to supplement university breeding education through grants, internships, collaborations, and also that USDA scientists should mentor or contribute to university courses. We found that there are gaps in the responses for examples on how the plant breeding profession can best be promoted and what USDA education and mentoring roles are most effective. For the last of the 5 questions about the short, medium-term USDA plant breeding goals, our stakeholders want us to focus on basic and applied research, including plant genes and genomics, machine learning, climate resilience, crop modeling algorithms, and GE traits. They would also like to see a centralized database for the National Plant Germplasm System that would be searchable for traits, plant information, and any restrictions on that germplasm. They would also like to see multiple paths for intellectual property and tech transfer. Gaps for these responses were examples of short, medium, and long-term goals for a crop, and intellectual property and technologies transfer's role in providing the most benefits and least hardships between the sectors. Now I will discuss what we heard from stakeholders during a live session where we had 130 participants. This was held in November 2020 with 5 breakout groups that addressed the 5 questions from above and focused on the gaps. First, I'll talk about some of the takeaways that we heard from the live breakout session. We heard that plant breeding for climate adaptation, climate change is a priority with a need for predictive tools. There's also a need for resilient crop and breeding to enhance diversity. For the National Plant Germplasm System, it would be important to expand the collection and to better characterize the collection and also to increase the NPGS's visibility. Stakeholders suggested that there should be more specific crop collaborations similar to the genetic enhancement in maize and genomes to fields for other crops. With the expanding use of cover crops, there should be breeding focus to include different geographic regions and growing seasons. And in order to increase throughput, speed breeding protocols should be developed for more crops. Continuing with the takeaways, the USDA should focus on basic and broad question of biology and plant breeding methods. There should be increased sabbatical opportunities for breeder exchanges between the universities, the seed industry, and the USDA. USDA scientists should promote mentoring of plant breeders and should contribute to college courses. It will also be important to breed for resilience and develop crops that better fit into rotation and intercropping. Lastly, there should be a focus on functional genomics in order to better understand what genes do and also to develop the tools to manipulate those genes. Using all this information from the information gathering website, from the live breakout sessions, and addressing the gaps, we pulled it all together and developed a succinct roadmap for the future of plant breeding. The roadmap can be accessed at this new web section. Next, I'll talk about its parts. The roadmap addressed that there should be a focus on crops and markets that currently or soon will have impact on public cultivars and/or public pre-breeding germplasm, and to ensure that there are genetic resources for specialty crops that meet the economic, cultural, and nutritional needs of all Americans. Also, that the entire breeding cycle should be addressed in an integrated way with balanced, appropriate effort and investment in phenotyping, genotyping, and selection phases of the cycle. The roadmap indicates the importance of developing and modeling novel and/or optimal methods for breeding program effectiveness and efficiency, with specific modeling and development areas including developing new in silico modeling frameworks for breeding research and education, modeling, piloting, and planning expansion of effective collaborations across the breeding cycle with communities funded by specific programs, and developing novel approaches to serve emerging markets and needs such as nutrition security, traditional foods, and citizen breeding programs, and includes projects that will create more and better market opportunities, allowing U.S. agriculture to access and sustain successful market growth. This supports the new USDA strategic plan, goal number 3. Continuing with developing and modeling, other roadmap areas include simulations to model. Other roadmap components include simulations to model and test full cycle needs, including value added and market feedback, to meet strategic goals for climate smart agriculture, equity and nutrition security, including partnerships with climate hubs and long-term agro-ecosystem projects, which supports USDA strategic goal 1.1. Modeling of breeding program shifts in response to feedbacks at varying timescales, such as climate change that leads to new environments and requires new predictions, and changes in the food system that shift priorities during the breeding cycle. I'd also like to mention that plant breeding has a role in developing superior genotypes of tree species that are commonly used for reforestation and also for non-timber species that are needed for ecological restoration. Continuing with developing and modeling, the development of breeding program models, for example, novel breeding targets, such as system-scale nutrition security, support for traditional diets, and breeding for enhanced nutritional quality that supports USDA strategic goal number 4. Safeguarding of plant health and enhancing food safety through the development of varieties with increased resilience to stress and disease, and varieties that promote healthy microbiomes that supports USDA strategic goal number 2. Breeding for polyculture optimization, including climate smart needs such as cover crops and regenerative systems, via developing novel methods and simulations to maximize predictive power. Breeding programs decision support tools for a full range of producers, including beginning farmers, urban agricultural systems, and controlled environment agricultural systems. Building out decision support for breeding of varieties cultivars that enhance local food networks and building food system resilience and market stability. And developing new methods and novel scalable validations to combine phenomics, including high throughput phenotyping, with high throughput genotyping to identify associations between changes in the DNA and observe differences in phenotype to ultimately predict the genotype by environment by management in future environments. The final components of the roadmap address connecting education and workforce development programs, startup and established businesses with focus on building human and decision-making skills and on simulation modeling forecasting future plant breeding skills. Developing and scaling new methods and programs for rapid development of targeted and effective plant breeding education programs for all audiences, and faculty and research professionals to enable shifts in focus to meet plant breeding needs, and increase access to program participation among underserved communities, supporting USDA Strategic Goal number 5. Developing and building out a plant breeding emphasis and stakeholder feedback integration for crops desired by tribal groups and underserved communities that help fulfill the administration's priority topics of equity and inclusion and nutrition security. The roadmap is a concise summary of input that we received from the website and from the live session. A more detailed summary is available at the meeting website in a document titled Takeaways and Summarized Stakeholder Comments from the Meeting. We also wanted to provide input in the website on who and how the roadmap can be best used. The roadmap provides guidance and information for many different audiences. For example, a student taking a breeding class can learn about the current state of plant breeding and future directions. A public plant breeder can use it to develop and apply ideas that reflect USDA's priorities. A private breeder might use it to recruit trained graduates who can onboard easily and add value immediately. The roadmap provides 16 examples of potential uses. Taking all this into consideration, I wanted to provide 4 examples of past USDA agencies' breeding success stories. For example, an ARS team from Fort Pierce, Florida released 12 new HLB-tolerant citrus rootstocks between 2007 and 2018. From 2018 to 2020, these rootstocks were used to produce nearly 3 million new citrus trees, or about 37% of all trees propagated in Florida, as a means to defend against citrus greening. NIFA provided a grant to support the hybridization of wheat, with more than 600 lines of hybrid wheat varieties that have been tested in Nebraska and Texas to support the development of hybridized wheat. NRCS, the National Resource Conservation Service, cooperatively released star germplasm long spike silver bluestem, which is a native perennial bunchgrass recommended for wildlife habitat improvement. And finally, the U.S. Forest Service has a program to develop white pine blister rust resistance in Oregon and Washington for sugar pine and western white pine. If you'd like to find out more about the roadmap, go to the U.S. Plant Breeding Research webpage. The page also has videos about USDA plant breeding, information on the 4 agencies' plant breeding activities, a great video on the basics of plant breeding. We look forward to any comments or input from you by responding to the roadmap comments email. The roadmap's a dynamic document and will be updated as needed. Thanks for your time, and I'm free to take any questions if there's time. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Paul. That was a great look into the future of plant breeding for us. Does anybody have questions for Paul? We have time, so raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you.
Yeah, I had a question about the stakeholders requesting that USDA incentivize, university course teaching and mentorship. Does that refer to ARS or is that through NIFA? I mean, I guess, and if it is for ARS, I guess that would be kind of a shift to the, I guess, philosophy that's held maybe in ARS at some levels.
Yeah, I'd say it's across all USDA. So all the agencies that are dealing with plant breeding, be it ARS, NIFA for funding, but also NRCS and the Forest Service of how best they can incentivize. USDA has such a wide range of breeding activities that it is far-reaching.
There's a couple down here.
I mean, one of your comments, you talked about how trying to make the national germplasm system more visible. It's one of those things that I would also like to do as someone who serves a database, a USDA database. I work with Soybase. I've been trying to integrate data from GRIN for some time. It seems like it's something that's been difficult, and I'm wondering, did the stakeholders say what information they're really searching for within the plant genome database? Was it specifically traits, or was it more about seed availability?
It was traits, but also I think they mentioned restrictions on use of the germplasm. I think they want a little bit more elaboration on if a variety is found, what are the specifics of it. I mean, it would be wonderful to have traits better characterized, to better characterize the system. But yeah, they did mention quite a few things that I would like to see.
We've got time for, we've got a couple more.
Thanks for your presentation, Paul. I saw the phrase breeding for climate adaptation, but not breeding for climate mitigation. Things like breeding for deeper roots that would sequester carbon. Did that topic figure into your discussions?
It did. It's especially from the Forest Service. I mean, when they are doing breeding, they have to think out 100, 200 years, and that you're creating something that really has to survive for millennia. So it's, yes, that was definitely both mitigation, adaptation, and all under the term climate change. What should the USDA be focusing on?
In the back, there's a question.
So I had a question about the stakeholder groups. I mean, these people are directing USDA policy and funding. You said it was over 100 stakeholders. I was just curious if you had more information about who these stakeholders are. What kind of groups of people are they? Scientists, politicians, growers, all the above?
It was everything from, yeah, all the above. And it was a wide range from university staff, a lot of NAPB participants, very wide, but also very different, I mean, diverse to have tree breeders. Often it's, when we talk with the Forest Service, they were really grateful that they had a chance to participate in that, because they often don't consider themselves to be breeders. But it was great to have forest tree breeding participation, and they really offered some different insights into what is important with regard to forestry. It was wide ranging.
Okay, any one more burning question? Anything else? Okay, well, I think that we should thank our speakers again, both of them for this session.